yeah, I can think about what causes suffering and I can work all this out in my mind. And I do think there are good logical answers that help us to understand how we exist in a world of suffering and also how a good and all-powerful God exists. And yes, I need those things for my mind to be satisfied. But at the end of the day, I'm looking for something that can satisfy my soul and my heart and that can bring me comfort in moments of hardship. And that I find in the cross and in what Jesus has done.
Welcome to Without Doubt, a podcast of New Beginnings Lakeside Church with Nathan Crowe and Pastor David Horner. We take hard questions and give you real biblical answers so that you can be without doubt.
Welcome back to Without Doubt, a podcast of New Beginnings Lakeside Church. I'm Nathan Crowe, and joining me as always is my friend, Pastor David Horner. Last week, we discussed the question of why do bad things happen to good people? We had a really good conversation about that, and we came to the conclusion last week. If you want to go back and watch that episode, we would encourage you to do so. But we came to the conclusion that bad things are in this world due to sin, due to our choice as humans to rebel against God. And so this week we kind of want to carry on that same idea, that same question, and just look at it a little more in depth. This is part 2 of last week's episode.
Right.
And so, I kind of want to start off just by asking the question or bringing up the discussion point of, suffering in the world, I believe, has 2 different perspectives. You've got the suffering of a non-believer, where I think we can both agree this question stems from. It's a question, like we said last episode, of usually tried to disprove God's existence in its entirety, or at least kind of damage his character. And then you've got the perspective of the believer, a believer who's facing trials or afflictions or some sort of pain.
Yeah.
And I think there's 2 different perspectives that can really be looked after here to get to the root of suffering and bad things happening because of sin.
Yeah. Yeah, you bring up a good point, is that in some worldviews, and take atheism as an example of this, all the suffering and the bad that you experience in life, it's really, at the end of the day, meaningless. There is no ultimate purpose behind it, no use for it, except, if we could just expel it, we would. And of course we would. I mean, anybody in any worldview would expel suffering. But there's really no payout for the suffering in that worldview. Now, the Christian has hope in the midst of their suffering, right? And that's actually what you see in James chapter 1, and I can pull it up here, where James says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." That's suffering.
Yeah.
"For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." So there's something that's happening, something that God is doing and using with our suffering that is bringing us further and further towards completion.
Yeah.
We are being built up into the image of Christ, and suffering, we know, brings us nearer to that. Or look at Romans 8 here. I'll pull this up as well. Of course, this is probably one of the top 5 most famous verses in the Bible. But we're told in Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. So suffering is useful in the hands of God.
Yeah.
It's redeemable in the hands of God. What man and what the enemy has intended for evil, God is able in his infinite wisdom to use that for good.
Yeah.
And I'm always so encouraged as I look at the cross and I say, that's the most suffering that a human being has ever experienced, what Jesus endured on the cross. And I'm not just talking about the physical aspect of it, the physical pain of his suffering. Of course, it was excruciating physically, but I mean, think about the other ways in which he suffered, being forsaken on the cross by everyone, by the Father. I mean, think about how bad it feels when you are alone, when you're lonely, when someone turns their back on you.
Yeah.
Now multiply that exponentially. All of the forsakenness that the world has ever felt, that was laid upon Jesus.
Yeah.
Or think about all the shame that you feel when you've done something you know is wrong.
Yeah.
And it eats you up and you feel so ashamed of it. Now multiply that
by every person who has ever existed.
Right.
Yeah.
And heap that all on one person.
Yeah.
In one moment. That's what Jesus was enduring. So Jesus was suffering in an immense capacity, and yet God took this event of unspeakable evil, an innocent man being crucified, of unspeakable suffering, and he used it for the salvation of all those who would believe. The greatest good that to ever come out of this world.
Yeah. God
used the greatest suffering and the greatest evil to create the greatest good.
Yeah.
So that really gives you hope in the midst of the suffering. And so that's why I wanted to turn to John 11 in this episode. And last time we talked about, it's not just a head question, it's a heart question. I think our hearts long to know, is there a solution and a hope for our suffering?
In case you missed last episode, what David means by, is it a head question or a heart question? Basically, at the root of last week's question, which was, why do bad things happen to good people? You know, we logically want to come to an answer to that, but ultimately we can't, because we can come up with all of these different answers that fall inadequate, because ultimately at the root of the question is a heart problem. It's somebody, you've been hurt or you've experienced suffering, and you want basically an answer for your heart as to, why did I have to go through that? Or why did somebody I love have to go through that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And we see this played out in the story of Lazarus. It's honestly probably my favorite story in the Gospels. I love this story. Basically, we're told in it of a man named Lazarus who has two sisters, Mary and Martha. They're friends of Jesus. Lazarus is ill. And so the sisters of Lazarus send to Jesus because they know one of their best friends and Jesus can heal people. He has the power to bring about a solution to their pain and to this illness that Lazarus has. And so the sisters, it says in John 11, verse 3, they send to him saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And I think this tells us something important about our own suffering, is that oftentimes we don't see that there is a purpose being worked out behind the scenes. That in the midst of the suffering, Jesus has purpose. Yeah. They don't know.
Which is funny, because, you know, how you led into this, they know what's up. You know, they've been around Jesus. And they know, like, through his miracles, that he can do anything, you know. But like you said, when it's their suffering, and they're in the midst of it, you know, we kind of get that tunnel vision.
Right.
And we lose that perspective.
Right.
But, you know, like the same people who, you know, they said, you know, the one you love and the friends of Jesus, the ones who, like, you know, they know a thing or two because they've seen a thing or two.
Right.
Like they should be the ones that understand this, but it's just easy. Like that should show us that we're not alone. Yeah. You know, that the same struggles we have whenever we kind of struggle in our faith, or like have that little tinge of doubt, you know, they had it too.
Right.
And so it's just like when we're in the middle of it, it's easy to get that tunnel vision.
Yeah. And they certainly had that. Jesus, in the meantime, is saying, hey, this illness, what is it? What's the purpose behind it? It's so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And I think that's something, like you're saying, when we get the tunnel vision. In the Christian worldview, we fail sometimes to realize, but God wants to use all things for his glory. Yeah. And for our good, we're told in Romans. But the primary purpose, Jesus says, in this suffering is that he's going to be glorified through it. See, our suffering, depending on how we suffer, there is the ability within it to bring glory to God. And that's something that God intends in the midst of all of it. That's a purpose. Now we're told in verse 5, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he made a beeline to Lazarus. No, it doesn't say that, right? Now, that's what you would expect it to say. Jesus, you love him. Aren't you going to get there as fast as you can to heal him? But it says actually that he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And basically, the effect that this is going to have is that by the time he actually gets to where Lazarus is at, Lazarus is going to have been dead for 4 days. Now, why did Jesus do this? Why did he sit and wait? Again, it makes no sense. From a human standpoint, we would think you need to be getting there ASAP, but he doesn't. Eventually, Jesus takes all of his disciples to the tomb, and he says, now when Jesus came, this is verse 17 of John chapter 11, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days, right? He's been dead for 4 days. Now, Jews, they had a belief about death, that when a person died, the spirit of that person would hover around the body for 3 days, seeking an opportunity to return.
And so,
but on the fourth
day, Lazarus is dead.
He's really dead.
I mean, there's no spirit hovering around the body.
No, I mean,
he is dead.
All hope is lost at this point. DEAD. I mean, totally dead. Right. Okay, you start to begin to see. Okay. Now we kind of see why, if the purpose is that Jesus is going to be glorified in it, well, what's more glorifying? That they have this superstition about, oh, maybe his spirit just came back and revived him. Because spoiler alert, Jesus is going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Yeah. Or is the greater glory going to be, no, we know for certain he was totally dead. And now he's back.
Because if he showed up on the first, second, or third day after, because of their beliefs, they could have explained that. They could almost have explained Jesus away. Right. You know, they could have just said, so what? Right. I mean, it's still impressive, but, so what? Like, this is what we believe. But because it was on the fourth day, there's no question where the power came from.
No, there's no other explanation.
Jesus is glorified.
Right. And so he shows up and knowing full well what he's going to do. Yeah. But whenever it says in verse 20, when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Basically, Martha knew that he had the power to heal him, but in her mind, she thought he didn't have the desire to heal him. He didn't have the will to heal him. And really, it goes back to this whole question the problem of suffering poses. How can an all-good and all-powerful God allow evil to exist in the world? Yeah. Now, some people might be willing to say, okay, he's all good. He just must not be powerful enough. Some people might say, well, he's all-powerful, but he's just not good enough to where he's willing to do that. And it seems like Martha kind of has that in her mind. She knows, there's no question of his power. Yeah. Lord, if you could have just got here, he wouldn't have died. Yeah. Why didn't you get here? But she expresses faith in verse 22. She says, even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Right? There's a belief in this general resurrection, saying, I know, Jesus. But Jesus said to her in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Basically, in the midst of our suffering, and I think this is the second thing we can see as it relates to this question in this passage. In the midst of our suffering, Jesus, not only does he have a purpose, but he wants to point us to himself. Yeah. He wants to use our suffering to draw us in to him. Mm-hmm. And so that's why he doesn't say, oh, don't worry, like Martha, yeah, he's going to be raised in the resurrection the last day. Or he doesn't even say, no, Martha, listen, I'm about to raise Lazarus from the dead, so just chill out.
Yeah.
Right? He says, I am the resurrection, the life. I am. You're like, Jesus.
All eyes on him.
All eyes on him.
Yeah.
And of course, he's making the claim that, as she's thinking about this general resurrection that's going to happen in the final day, he's saying, look, that's all connected to me.
Yeah.
You have that right in front of you right now. And I love how Jesus basically takes the spotlight and he puts it on himself. Yeah. He forces us to look to him. I think that's what if we want to find solace for our souls and in our hearts in times of suffering, that's what we have to do.
Yeah.
We have to look to Jesus, who claims to be the resurrection and the life, who claims to be the gentle and lowly one, who will not break a bruised reed, who's hurting and who's suffering, but who will gently, bring them into his loving embrace. That's where the solution is found, and I think from a heart standpoint.
Yeah.
But then he confronts Martha. He says, do you believe this? And she said in verse 27, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. Now, she still doesn't understand what he's about to do because she's going to be shocked when he does it. But basically, Jesus comes and talks to Mary. Mary is the other sister, and we're told in verse 32, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet. She's going to have a moment here with Jesus, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Yeah.
Same thing that Martha said. They probably had talked about it. Man, where's Jesus? If only he would get here, But we're told this time Jesus doesn't respond in the same way. It says, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved. Now this word, it's two words in English that they've translated here, deeply moved. But it's actually a word that means indignant. He was indignant in his spirit and greatly troubled. That's what it says.
Yeah.
Why was Jesus indignant? That is, surely he wasn't indignant at the suffering women. The emotion. No, but I believe that what you see, because what we're about to see is this tenderness just pour out of the heart of Jesus. What you're seeing here is as he got there to the scene, he saw all the weeping. He saw what death had brought.
Yeah.
He was indignant at sin and death and the enemy and the havoc that it wreaks upon his creation. And thinking back to last week, and we had talked about, is God going to do something about it?
Yeah.
Or is God just going to leave us in our rebellious, sinful state that's bringing suffering and death daily into this world? He came into the world to do something about it. Jesus was indignant at the effects that this is having. And I love that depiction I get in my mind when I think about Jesus, who has basically this resoluteness about him, saying, I've come here to take care of business.
Yeah.
But this indignance and this great troubling, it causes him in verse 34. He says, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And then we have the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept.
Yeah.
And this is the third thing that I think we need to see in the midst of our suffering, is that, yes, Jesus has come to do something about it. And how does he go about doing that? He enters into it.
Yeah.
Now that's mind-blowing. That there is no other worldview where the God who had created everything perfectly, who created a paradise on earth, and then we went
and messed it up.
And we messed it up. And how is he going to deal with it? He's going to enter into it with us. Yeah. That's crazy.
Everything else is, get up the staircase and get closer to God.
Right.
And, with Christianity, Jesus, God in the flesh, came down to meet us.
Right.
Because we couldn't.
Yeah. And it's not that he's not powerful enough. Jesus knows what he's about to do.
Yeah.
He's about to raise Lazarus from the dead.
The dead.
The dead. That's right. But before he does that, he pauses to weep with those who are weeping. And I think that that's something we need to remember when we're in times of suffering, is that Jesus, he's feeling what we're feeling.
Yeah.
He knows what it is that we're going through. He's experienced it. And there is no more compassionate, empathetic person in this universe than Jesus himself, who is willing, even though he doesn't have to, even though he has the power to fix everything.
Yeah.
But he's willing to step into the suffering with us. And what is the result of that? That we can grow deeper. Yeah. We can go deeper with him. That's what he does. So the Jews said in verse 36, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Now remember the whole charge with the problem of suffering. How can a good God, who's also all-powerful, allow bad things to happen? Well, we saw with Martha, she was like, "Lord, I know you're powerful enough. Mm-hmm. Why weren't you here?" These people are saying, this guy could have opened the eyes of the blind man, or who has opened the eyes of the blind man. He could have kept this man from dying. So he must not have been willing to do it. Whereas some of the other Jews are saying, "See how he loved him. Oh, he loved him. He must have just not been able to heal him. Look at how much he loved Lazarus."
So there's two questions. There's a question of he must not have had the power.
Right.
And the question of basically the same question we're answering, stemming all the way back, right?
Yeah.
Some of the Jews were asking this question of basically, oh man, he's all good, but he just didn't
have the will.
Yeah.
That's what half the Jews are saying. He loved him. He must have just not been powerful enough. The other Jews are saying, no, he's powerful. He opened the eyes of the blind man. He could have healed him, but he just must not have had the will to do it.
Yeah.
And isn't that the same accusation that's made in the whole problem of suffering, like that was being made against Jesus in this moment? But then it says in verse 38 that Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone lay against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." Of course, the King James Version is the best in this. "Surely he stinketh."
Surely he stinketh.
That's what she says. But Jesus says, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" Mm-hmm. And so they take away the stone. Jesus lifts up a prayer to the Father, and he cries out, "Lazarus, come out," with a loud voice. And Lazarus, he comes out.
Yeah.
And I think this is a foretaste, right? A preview of what's to come. Mm-hmm. Because Lazarus was resurrected in that moment, and that was an amazing moment, no doubt.
Yeah.
But Lazarus, we know, would go on to die again, right? The guy had to die twice, really. But what was Jesus giving us in this moment? He was giving us a foretaste of what's to come. And this is the last thing that we see in this story relating to suffering, is that Jesus has a plan to wipe suffering out for all time. And that's what he came to do.
And I almost feel like that's what he was indignant about, seeing suffering in his, what was perfect creation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's seeing that and recognizing the pain that that's causing. He came to do something about it, and he promises now, when you get to the book of Revelation, what you find is that God's plan is to restore and even go above and beyond what Eden was meant to be. Mm-hmm. Everything that we lost in Eden when Adam and Eve fell and they ate the fruit is restored back and then some in Jesus. So that the end of all things, we're told, for those who have placed their faith into Christ, is that he will wipe away every tear from their eye. That there will be no more pain, no more suffering. That the eternity we look forward to is an eternity of just pure, bliss.
God's goal is to return back to what once was.
And that's what he's going to do to this earth.
Yeah.
He's going to turn it back into Eden, essentially, and he's going to come once again and dwell physically present. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know he's indwelling us now through his Spirit, but he's going to be physically present dwelling among his people on this earth. And that's what we're moving towards. All of that, though, is because of the cross. Yeah. Because Jesus died. He suffered on our behalf. Mm-hmm. He dealt with suffering by becoming a sufferer himself. And as he hung there on the cross, what he was doing was paying for all of the sin that causes the bad things to happen to you and me. Yeah. All of the sin that has caused this death and this decay and this destruction in this world that we live in, Jesus was paying the bill, essentially, for all of that. He was heaping that upon himself. Mm-hmm. But then, after he died, he rose again from the dead, showing us, hey, this is, first, it's defeated. Like, that's what his resurrection signifies. It's like a receipt of purchase, saying, you own this now, right? And he has the authority now to resurrect us and to give us eternal life. And so we look to him in the midst of our suffering. I think that's the ultimate answer that, for my soul, at least. Yeah, I can think about what causes suffering and I can work all this out in my mind. And I do think there are good, logical answers that help us to understand how we exist in a world of suffering and also how a good and all-powerful God exists. And yes, I need those things for my mind to be satisfied. But at the end of the day, I'm looking for something that can satisfy my soul and my heart and that can bring me comfort in moments of hardship. And that I find in the cross and in what Jesus has done. So I feel like that's really, in my own life at least, how I've reckoned with this question, why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah, I think that perfectly sums up, how we as believers, what that suffering, what that trial, as James calls it, what that affliction, how God is trying to use that in our lives, refocus us on him, bring glory to him in the midst of the trial. Right. And, for the unbeliever, suffering, I really think can truly is a tool of God, to break down that pride. Yeah. To break down that, because if you think about it, a life without trial, a life without pain, a life without suffering, what is that? That's Eden. That's going back to perfection. And we saw what happened there. Adam and Eve got to the point where they were deceived and kind of thought we know better. They kind of, the pride, they puffed themselves up. And so, for the unbeliever, I would say that when you're facing suffering, when you're facing trials of any kinds, that God is using that as a tool to bring you to your knees, to realizing I can't do this on my own. Right. There is something else I need. Yeah. And maybe you don't know that yet. Yeah. Maybe you are unaware of what that need is. But, like we've been talking about, for the believer, God came down through Jesus. Right. To meet us in our suffering, to become the sufferer, to free us eventually from suffering. Yeah. And so I think for the unbeliever, God will use suffering to point, again, back to Jesus.